Welcome to another episode of the Vikingology podcast. I'm co-host number one, CJ Adrian.
And I am co-host number two, Terry Barnes. And we are Vikingology, the art and science of the Viking Age. And today we have our second guest to talk about the law, which I think is really interesting. One of them is my PhD supervisor, and so I geek out on that stuff for sure. But today we have, yay, a fellow American. Sorry for all the European scholars that have been on the show. But we have Dr. Jake Stadel, who is from Philadelphia, but is living in the UK because he is a postdoc research fellow at the University of Cambridge. Also did a stint at Harvard, right?
Just visiting last year.
Just visiting, yeah, but still, Harvard. But so you're looking at the legal importance of the Danelaw and the Viking settlement in England. And so for those in our audience maybe who don't know what that is, we definitely will get into hopefully having Jake describe what the heck is the Danelaw and why would the English give part of their country to the Vikings? That doesn't make any sense. But so now you're with the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic, which I think is, people can check that out online. There's a lot of good information there that you can find. But one of the things that I want to talk to you about for sure is your bio talks about you looking at new approaches and wider sources. And we want to know what those are because CJ and I always talk on this show about how like we're all just trotting over the same sources year after year, trying to come up with something new to say about the Viking Age. And so, anyway, but welcome to our show.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I've watched quite a few episodes and I'm a big fan.
Wow. Well, you watched the episodes and you still showed up, so that's good, right,
Uh,
That gives me some confidence for today's discussion.
CJ? So, well, yeah. So, explain a little bit now about how you got into this, like legal. I mean, because you're a historian, and we talk to a lot of archaeologists, but you're a historian like us. Woohoo! Shout out historians, but a legal historian. So that's a really interesting subdiscipline. So, talk to us about that.
yeah, although first, before I forget, I should mention, as you said about the Department of ASNAC here at Cambridge, which, if anyone doesn't know, is just a really special, unique program that, as far as I know, doesn't exist anywhere else in the world that kind of lets people study all across this period, essentially all early medieval Northwest Europe in whatever area you're particularly interested in a kind of an interdisciplinary way. So if anyone is interested in undergraduate or postgraduate work there, definitely encourage them to check it out and apply. That we're always looking for more people.
Yeah, we
Um,
could put the link in the show notes.
oh, but I am a bit of an outsider to that department because I'm come from the history department and that's my background. And coming to this project that I do was really a surprise to me, and I never expected to be a legal historian. But I think maybe that's a bit of a way to show that when we do early medieval history, we have to be really open to kind of whatever sources we can use, and we have to use them in kind of new creative ways. And that's how I started to use legal sources to see things that are really difficult to see. That's mostly down to my supervisor in my master's and PhD was Tom Lambert here at Cambridge and his work on Anglo-Saxon law. So sort of he presented this problem to me that we know there's something different going on in what our early English legal sources call the Danelaw. And we see sort of little hints of where they mention the word Danelaw, and then there's little differences here and there. But no one had really kind of delved into trying to understand what's really going on there and what does Danelaw mean. So that's essentially what I've been doing for the last few years.
Wow, after all this time, it's sort of so interesting, right? Like the basic thing that nobody really delved into, defining
Oh,
what it
yes
is.
and no, right? I mean, people, it's just you bring in kind of a fresh approach to new things, and all of this is very debated, of course, because that's kind of everything that we do in this early medieval. And so it's about just trying to kind of come up with interesting theories and make pieces of evidence kind of work together.
Okay, so what is the Danelaw then for people that
Yeah.
don't know?
Well, I guess everyone will probably give you a different answer. So that's kind of the first part of trickiness. So, in one sense, when we use it today, we mean kind of this geographic term for North and East England that was conquered initially by this great Viking army in the 860s, 870s. But then, kind of importantly for what I do, and as I'm sure a lot of your guests have talked about, especially in archaeology, is that we really know now that there was then subsequent settlement and probably multiple waves of settlement of quite a lot of people. And I think kind of current consensus estimates are talking about tens of thousands of men, women, and children kind of migrating to England in that period. Maybe even into the 10th century, people are still coming in, possibly. And there's a big kind of demographic shift, meaning that we have to think of a unique kind of Anglo-Scandinavian culture and societies popping up here. Um, and so uh, calling that the Danelaw gets slightly complicated because that's not the terms that are used initially. Um, Although by around the year 1000, we see the word Danelagu in English legal records, talking about the different law in those areas. And then over time, that becomes a geographic descriptor. So we have to be careful about it. And it's, a bit anachronistic to kind of push back and call it all the Danelaw from the early period. But I think since we get it by the year 1000 and then it's talked about, I think it's not too bad. And that as long as we're just being clear in what we mean. And at the same time, I should point out there's no one thing that is the Danelaw, right? This was not a unified government or kingdom in any sense, so even from the earliest period, these are kind of different, as far as we can tell, completely independent, autonomous groups of people. Maybe these are sort of chiefdoms based around, even an individual town. We have our records tell us about the army of the borough of a town, such as the five boroughs of Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and each of those seem to be self-governing, which then becomes important because when the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that, spoiler alert, they all ended up getting conquered by the English across the 10th century and become part of this West Saxon kingdom. Individually, they're being conquered, or they're making peace, or they're coming to terms and they're negotiating. So yeah, that's kind of how I think of the Danelaw and try to get into it.
Do we have any sense of the population, the existing population before that migration? So we're talking about tens of thousands of people coming over, but if it's 12 million people, I mean, that's a drop in the proverbial bucket versus if it's only, 80,000 people in that territory. So do we know kind of what they were mixing into?
I mean, no, is the difficult thing. And so I think that the important basic point is when we're making these estimations is kind of traditionally 20th century historians, kind of for good reason, given the evidence they had at the time, um, concluded that there was very few kind of numbers of Vikings that came in, and they were just sort of these male warriors at the top of the social hierarchy. They kind of moved in and became the new aristocracy. I think the really interesting stuff that's happened in the last 20 years is overturning that and telling us that there's all sorts of Vikings were coming over in this period. And so we don't really know much of the details of exactly how this happened on the ground. And there's a lot of other people who work more in this space about hybrid identities. And obviously, it's a complicated process, right? We don't think that they killed everyone there or pushed everyone out. But it wasn't necessarily all peaceful either. So clearly, there's a bit of both going on. But to answer your question, I think we can estimate, this is about half of modern England. And from some later population estimates, we think it was actually probably made up the majority of the population of England was these areas known as Danelaw. Now, of course, were all of these people Danish or were ethnically Scandinavian or were felt that way? We have no idea, and likely not. But it was being defined, even well into the period in which it was all part of England. It was being defined through this Danish ethnic identity, which was often through the law. And kind of talking of Danish law sort of meant this area, even if maybe that doesn't necessarily mean Danish people. And then we get information from Doomsday Book, which comes in 1086, that obviously also very tricky, but people try to use estimations for that as well. So just to say about population, I think the usual estimate is that the population of all of England was about 3 million by 1066. And based off of that and just how heavily populated some of these parts of the Danelaw were, like Norfolk and Suffolk, actually the majority of that population was in those areas, which if they're defined by having a different law, it's kind of important to figure out what it was.
I mean, it's interesting to me teaching this to my students because then, of course, invariably you sort of get up, some sort of rudimentary map that's like, here's the Danelaw, right? And it kind of carves it out as though there's like a boundary, like, and always sort of reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with sort of the history of the Cold War and the policy of containment, right?
Mm.
So you're like, all right, well, this is the way we're going to deal with them. We're just going to give them this space, and then we're just going to make sure they stay over there and they live by their own laws and their own customs and stuff like that. But like, so how, I mean, given what we know, I think about like borders and boundaries and even in a legal sense, like in so much of the research that I've read in just general medieval history talk about things like, oh, and they owned so much land that they didn't even really legally know like where the border of their land, sort of began and end in some places and stuff. So how can we be sure when we look at these maps online that say, here's the Danelaw, that outline was it? And then, is there like, the border where they check your passport, as you're going through to make sure, this kind of stuff. And how did that work from a boundary standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we don't really know. I think we can say there is not kind of a clear physical border or boundary. And you'll probably also notice almost all those maps will be slightly different. And that's the really tricky thing, especially as they go further north and when it gets to kind of the northwest of England, of really unclear what is what in there. And some people will put Cumbria into the Danelaw, some people won't. Um, so everyone making a map does it differently because we just don't know. Um, so I think usually the historic document that people will cite and talk about is this Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, which people often call the Treaty of Wedmore. It's important to remember we don't know if it is the Treaty of Wedmore. That's the term from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. We could assume that these are the same things, but we don't know. So the idea being that this is probably after Alfred the Great defeated Guthrum in this Battle of Edington in 878. At some point after that, they kind of made a boundary agreement, and then this treaty resulted from it at some point in the 880s. But it's important to remember that even if that is actually what this is, which we can't really be positive about, it would just be kind of the border of Alfred's Wessex with Guthrum's Kingdom of East Anglia, which is just one part of what we think of as the Danelaw and of these different areas of Scandinavian settlement, which primarily include, also this Kingdom of Northumbria, as well as probably many other independent things that, would have nothing to do with Guthrum and this treaty. And so that's why it gets very tricky of what this actually means. And then there's a debate about the treaty talks about the rivers and the Thames, and then up the River Lee, and then along this Roman road to Watling Street. It's very unclear if it means it ends at this Roman road or if it is going on and continuing along it towards Chester, which is what people often assume. And that's why you get that map that kind of makes this diagonal
Yeah.
kind of towards the northeast. But we have to be really open that there's really not much basis for us to think that. And there's lots of other interesting sources to look at, such as distribution of archaeological finds, which might make us think something else. And then people have traditionally also looked at place name evidence. And that might give us a different picture as well. So it's a matter of kind of bringing those together, thinking about it, thinking about concentrations in different places, and understanding that we just can't know. And that's something that Leslie Abrams and David Parsons they wrote a really important chapter in 2004 about. And I was really excited that actually just last week they gave a talk about how they're getting back into that work and trying to bring these different resources together to tell us about Scandinavian settlement.
Yeah, because it would seem to me to be interesting then, I mean, as a historian, I'm usually trying to sort of, get into the headspace of the people at the time, right? And experience the world the way they did it. And if I'm somebody who came over from, I don't know, Norway or whatever, and with my husband, the warrior, and my kids and everything, and then like, do I have a sense of like, if I go, 5 miles over there, I'm now in English territory and not over here where I'm safe? Or like, what does that even mean as a legal distinction for people?
Yeah. Well, so that is kind of one of the questions that I'm interested in. I think we can't really know. There probably was not a set border that was really clear in that way, but I think there is an aspect of this law applies in this area and this law applies in that area, and that's what they're implying when all these English records talk about under the Dane law. They usually contrast them and say under Dane law this happens, under English law this happens. Um, and so, in that sense, I guess I'm not particularly worried about the geographic exactness of that. I just care about what did that actually mean when you were in this realm that was under the control of this different law, and how did it look differently. And as far as we can tell, I think it actually was different, and some of these sources give us hints into that there are significant kind of procedural differences, and that if you committed a certain crime in an English district, it's going to be treated quite differently than it would be in one of these Dane law districts.
What about the overlay of canon law in there?
Yeah, I that is not particularly my area. I've definitely focused more on secular things. But I think in general, we don't think about there being too much influence on that in this kind of early period, and that the kind of secular Anglo-Saxon laws are this really early kind of corpus of record that we have that seems quite unique in that way, and then, but of course, is influenced from things from Francia and from canon law in other ways. And then my work has been mostly trying to contrast kind of this known corpus we have with the little fragments that we get from the Dane law. And if you want, we can talk about that and kind of how I've approached that.
Hmm. So I have a little bit of a left field question. It has to do with some of the topics we've discussed with previous guests, Claire Downham being one, Tom Horn, discussing this idea of nodes. I think we talked about it with Christian Koymans as well. He applied that in the Frankish realm. But these economic nodes that were co-opted essentially, and because they were co-opted, then the local population adapted by learning Norse language, customs, etc., as essentially turning it into a lingua franca. So then these very small groups of people come in and exact a disproportionate amount of influence on an area because they control the economic levers of that area. So I'm wondering with the Dane law and in terms of, okay, so we can't really see what the border is. Right now it's, as you said, just a diagonal line up this one road, and then we think that's good enough. But I'm wondering if there's a way to look at it from that node perspective and seeing like, if people who fall into the Dane law, it's not because they're on one side of a border or another, it's the ease of access to a certain node. So if this node is controlled by
Mm,
Alfred and the West Saxons, then I'm going to follow English customs, law, language, etc. But then if one day the area of exchange that I go to for my livelihood has been co-opted by Norsemen, then I'm going to adapt to that and say, all right, well, what can I do? And so now I'm following a new set of laws and that sort of thing. Is that something that perhaps could be used to try and maybe not delineate, because you said that, we're not talking about borders, but maybe like a heat map of Norse law in England. Does that make sense?
I do think that's a much more helpful way to think of it. Of course, the trouble is, we can't. That doesn't really help us make a map or something because we just don't have the evidence, right, of
Hmm.
certain areas that are having certain effects or not. But I think in general, that is the way to think about this. That I think the way that I envision of how does different law kind of come to this part of England and then eventually get recorded and written down in English sources is because it is this kind of Scandinavian elite, which by the time the particularly the record that I use, the Wantage Code, which is a law code of Ethelred II, but which I think is clearly directed towards the Danelaw. Well, it says that it's for the five boroughs. And this is in 997. So at this point, we're talking about the children or grandchildren, right, of Vikings. And so we can probably think of them as Anglo-Scandinavian elites. And I think that they're the ones in positions of local power by this point in nodes, in that they are probably the ones who are controlling the different, small urban areas, like the five boroughs of the East Midlands, which are the ones that are specifically talked about here. And so, in that sense, I think we could think of which of these areas kind of was under the influence of whoever was deciding things within each of these boroughs, probably even independently. But then by this point, 100 years later, we see them talking about it and actually writing down some of the specifics of how things are different over here in contrast to the rest of England. And of course, the whole issue of borders kind of matters less now because they're all part of this same kingdom, essentially, at this point. They're just kind of an area of special jurisdiction, kind of within the bigger kingdom of England. So, figuring out exactly what that means and who's controlling what.
I mean, coming from the three of us, coming from the United States, I mean, and I'm actually, my husband and I are just sort of diving into Ken Burns's recent, American
Mm.
Revolution. Like the whole issue, what's coming to mind there is kind of a states' rights kind of issue, right? You sort of have polities within polities where, things are a little bit different just over there, kind of.
Yeah, well, and I think we're definitely getting hints that across this, it is a very long process in the 10th century of the Danelaw being conquered by the kings of Wessex and eventually incorporated into this kingdom. And I think we can see here and there that it's not just military conquest and takeover. There's a lot of negotiation and there's a lot of peace. And I think even you can see a back and forth sometimes in a way that if you kind of just read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, kind of talking about this king conquering this and winning all these battles and being celebrated, that maybe you'll miss. So, for example, kind of part of the point that I make is about in the reign of Edgar that we usually think of Edgar as this really important king who's kind of finally consolidating the English kingdom and really bringing it together into a more organized way and bringing all these different sections within it. And, they're never really lost after that. And that's kind of the final kind of consolidation. But at the same time, he has this, his known as his fourth law code, Witbordistan code, in which he specifically says the Danes can continue their own good laws, godum lagum. And then two more times in this code, he talks about that they should be able to do law in their own areas in the way that they want, specifically contrasting it with things that he's saying in other parts of England, in the English areas, that they have to do it this way. The Obviously the bit disappointing part is since he basically leaves them to do whatever they want in the law, we don't know what it is because he doesn't say anything more about it. But I think it's showing us this process a little bit that even by this point in the 960s, there's a bit of a back and forth. And you can interpret this in all sorts of different ways, but I lean towards the way of it seems like he is making some sort of concession to people in these areas of England who want to continue to practice their own law. And maybe it's a concession in that they're becoming part of this more consolidated Kingdom of England and they're allowing some reforms and they are adapting some of what he wants, which particularly in this code is about theft. But they're keeping their own legal customs and other things. And maybe there's a back and forth, and maybe it's a compromise, which actually I think is the same process that's happening about 30 years later in the Wantage Code of Ethelred, is bringing them into the English legal system, giving them some regulations, but then otherwise is allowing some of their particular legal practices to continue to the point that they're even writing them down and recording them in that text.
Was it, excuse me, wasn't there an incident where the English king, I'm trying to remember, somebody ordered all the Danes killed at one point, didn't
St.
they?
Bryce's Day, St. Bryce's
Yeah.
Day.
Okay, there we go. Same
Yeah.
price. Sorry, I'm more into the Frankish Empire, but yeah, it's in Ireland. But yeah, yeah, same price today. So how did that affect all of this landscape?
Well, so that was also Ethelred, Ethelred the Unready. So that's also a particularly tricky thing to think about when we're trying to understand this. And I think in general, it shows that this is a complicated process that's going back and forth at different points. And I think even in Ethelred's reign, we see him negotiating with Scandinavian groups and making peace with them, and then also being really concerned and anxious about them. And the St. Brice's Day massacre seems to be kind of him responding to what he thought was going to be continued unrest and threats in a really, really brutal way. I should also say it's quite unclear what exactly happened and who they meant by the Danes. And so I think the usual interpretation now is that massacre of the Danes probably meant kind of Danish newcomers who were probably in Wessex itself, probably mercenaries, because he had hired a lot of mercenaries by this point. And then, of course, maybe you talked to another guest about there's that really interesting uh, burial pit that they found in St. John's College, Oxford. That's sort of, to my understanding, the leading theory of what that is that those were a bunch of young Scandinavian warriors that were captured and executed, and then buried in a mass grave together, probably during this massacre. But I it's really unclear if this was also something happening elsewhere in the country. And I think it's quite unlikely that this also was a massacre in the Danelaw of people who, again, by this point, we're talking about settled populations who've been there for probably over 100 years. It's pretty unclear who is a Dane or who's not a Dane, probably from much earlier on. And I think we would get a bit more in the records if we think there was a widespread sort of genocide happening in the Danelaw in a way that
Mhm.
we don't think happened. So definitely tricky. And I think it's one point to shows that this is an ongoing kind of tension and concern of control. And I think the English kings we can see over and over, they're quite worried about Scandinavians in their own country, and they're worried about new coming kind of Viking armies teaming up with Scandinavians that are there. And maybe the St. Brice's Day massacre is kind of one of those points coming to a head.
Mhm.
Yeah, because I posted that on our Instagram, a picture of the skeletons in
Oh,
the
okay.
burial. Yeah, because Saint for those of you out there who may not know, like Saint Brice's Day just happened like a couple of weeks ago, right?
I
It was,
didn't know that actually.
yeah, I think it's November 13th. But yeah, in the year 1002. So just for context for people of when this is going on. But I mean, I can't even imagine just sort of I mean, always trying to do sort of thought experiments, thought experimenting myself into the past and being in Ethelred's brain and be like, all right, I'm tired of negotiating with these people and not getting anywhere. Let's just kill all of them. I'm like, how does that decision sort of get taken? And then how do you, like you're saying, like how do you even know if they are all Dane? How are you targeting? Because I don't even know if we know exact numbers, but I mean, it was a lot of people who ended up dying. They ended up wiping out a lot, didn't they?
Well, I guess we don't really. I think it's mostly these chronicle references to it,
Yeah.
so we don't really know much. But
But you got all those skeletons. I mean, so it's like it's more
yeah,
than just
yeah,
a couple dudes.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. It was a lot of people. So,
Right.
well, so I want to back up just slightly though, in kind of just sort of the teacher in me usually, just to make sure that people understand, like what we were talking about before. This is a common thing, I'm using the word common, but in the Middle Ages, can you just kind of do a little basic description of what medieval Europe was dealing with regards to the distinction between customary and then common law?
Well, this is kind of too early for that to even really be much of a factor because we usually think of common law coming in England in the 12th century, and
Okay.
although it becomes really complicated what we mean by that, it seems like the original meaning was meaning that was kind of the standard law for the entire country of England, kind of uniting more local customs and kind of regional customs and maybe even different towns and boroughs would have their own things that were now being rolled into a more consolidated law, which actually is quite relevant to what my PhD was working on, and is because I think in the centuries before that, and essentially if we're talking 900 to 1200, that we see the Danelaw being talked about as a kind of separate, distinctive kind of law within England, that at least at different points kind of throughout that period is specifically mentioned as something different. And I think we get hints of kind of what that actually meant in different ways. And then that's kind of ending with that creation of common law in the 12th century, and particularly under Henry II in 1166. And so that's kind of the English context that I've been working in. And to be fair, that's kind of where I've specialized. So I don't even know too much about comparing it to the continent, but I think it is quite distinctive. And when we have this Anglo-Saxon legal customs that we can compare to things from, Francia and early medieval Germany and elsewhere. But I think it is somewhat helpful to kind of look at it in its own context and then kind of compare out.
Yeah, because I think it goes back, at least to my mind, to what CJ was saying earlier about the nodes and stuff, because some
Mm.
of my understanding of it, albeit limited, but just sort of trying to help my students understand what was going on in that period of thinking about living in your own, kind of village, borough, whatever. Like, okay, here's the custom here. So, like, if you do this, this is what's going to be the punishment for that or what have you. But then when you start to have kind of what historians call the commercial revolution, sort of development of more of these nodes, economic centers, towns, whatever, but that you're going to have sort of these crossroads, right, of people who are not all from the same borough anymore and maybe even speaking different dialects or whatever. And so then how do you govern under which law in a place like that where it's a mixture of people who can't just sort of bring their own custom with them, and practice it there? So I guess, yeah, maybe not a question there, but just sort of a comment about how learning how to develop that. I don't think we think about that very much in the modern world of, why that's necessary when you have, people coming from all different places. Okay, what's the law here then?
Yeah, and I mean, even just practically, right, of how do you do business and things like
Yeah.
that. And that's why one of the things I've gotten a bit interested in is some of these peace treaties with the Vikings and kind of the treaties between the English and different Viking armies. So not really the Danelaw, which are kind of settled groups of people, but with newly coming armies, which are then kind of written as law, as legislative texts. And that first one, although kind of different, is that Alfred and Guthrum. But then there's a handful of others, and it's all very practical things of how do you essentially kind of mediate between these two groups, and what happens if someone kills someone in the other group. How do you handle that? Importantly, in a different way than you would if it was just within England and among Englishmen. So and then there's a lot of regulations about trade as well. So that's a constant kind of concern that I think maybe we'd be surprised that there's relatively sophisticated, at least thought going into it by the time we get into the 10th century and we have some of these records popping up.
Yeah.
Boy, what a weird thing to, be in your country and these guys show up and they're ruthless and violent. They're attacking monasteries. And then next thing you know, they're moving in next door to you. And you're like, so is he going to trade with me today or is he just going to take my stuff?
And then under which law will he be
Are
prosecuted?
they, if any? I mean, what if their law says that's totally okay? I mean, because I think isn't it, when we're talking with Rayner and William, we talked about, the, they, the example in Sweden where some people hold up in a church, they burned it down. They're like, it's fair game because you challenged us, right? And so it's like, and then what constitutes as a challenge? And it's like, you look, he gave me a look. What? What look? You gave me a look. Now I'm going to take your stuff. It's like, and so yeah, it sounds to me like the ninth century and 10th century. Sorry, no, we're mostly talking about 10th century, right? Was a pretty ungovernable time in English history. I mean, it must have been.
Although that's the time everything's consolidating, isn't it? I mean, you got the first king of England showing up, what, in the 930s? The
Yeah,
king
well,
of all of
depending who you think
England.
it was. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's the interesting thing of I think England actually is a pretty unique example, kind of compared to almost anywhere else in Europe at this time of it is actually becoming quite consolidated, quite organized, really, really efficient at collecting taxes, which again, just to relevance for Vikings of talking about the Danegeld of it's really miraculous that they were able to collect these massive, massive sums of money to pay the Danegeld kind of by the end of the 10th century, and created a really detailed infrastructure with which to do that, which essentially became kind of the standard English tax system forever after that was begun in order to collect geld. And yeah, I think we'd be surprised that, as you're alluding to Ethelstan, of he's a really important legislative king, and he's making a lot of laws, and he's concerned about a lot of areas. His biggest area of concern that particularly Tom Lambert has worked on really seems to be theft. And Ethelstan has this kind of campaign against theft that, as far as we can tell, I mean, it seems like when he's pretty much trying to get rid of theft in the entire kingdom that he controls now, or at least make extremely severe penalties that act as a deterrent, it seems to be pretty effective. And there's some clues into this, including that in one of his later codes, he actually, well, in his early one, he says, I believe it's anyone over the age of 13 caught as a thief will be killed immediately. But he then later raises the age limit a little bit, which might imply that this actually was happening. This was effective, and people were upset about it because it was too much and seen as going too far, which might surprise us of that an English king is even able to kind of go too far in regulating law and order, that he then might have to kind of stand back a little bit and push back.
Oh, like,
Pretty good.
yeah. Like they don't
But
want absolutism that
well,
early,
I mean,
right?
who knows? I
Yeah.
think maybe this was a particularly brutal thing of executing 13-year-olds, and maybe fair enough that there's some resistance to it.
Well,
Although, do they, yeah,
it'll
13 though, in those days, you could still be almost wet at your majority. And like,
Yeah, it all kind of ties back into the social contract, though, right? I mean, it's so that people are listening to these laws because I mean, and it could just be. I mean, I'm just riffing here, and there's no basis in this. I'm just off the top of my head of just thinking through, like, the like you said, by second, third generation, we're really talking about Anglo, Danish mixed people who are in power and so forth. And so most of the common people are going to be just English. And so if the King of England says something, then they're, even if the local lord has got some weird one-off rules that he wants you to follow, right? It stands to reason that by the time you get a couple generations in, then people are kind of listening to the main, it kind of like the monarchy today, right? Like it's when they speak, people listen. And so that kind of celebrity effect, maybe, right? So it's maybe an advantage the English king had over any of these Danish guys who came in or Danish descendants to uh, to exert power over the area. So just thinking out loud, that's kind of. But that is interesting that oh, wait a minute, anybody over 13 caught stealing is going to be killed. I can just imagine, somebody in a village and it's just like little 14-year-old gets caught stealing, as 14-year-olds will do. And then it's just like, the executioner just like, wait, is this real? Yeah, these are the rules. You have to follow it. I don't know why they're all
Yeah, well, of
Norwegian,
course,
but
it's tricky, right? Because we know so little about the period. We have these really comparatively very good records of the laws themselves, but we do not have very good records of cases, right? So of these things actually happening. We have a handful, and of course it gets confusing when it looks like in the handful, it seems like they're actually not following the way that they are in the laws. And so that's kind of one of those big unknown questions in this field that we have to deal with. And so, yes, how are these enforced on the ground? Were people really kind of opening up a book and seeing what the law was and following it? Um, I think the most likely thing is that it's a complicated process that's different in different periods, and definitely on a local level, there's quite a high level of interpretation. And I think we see little bits of evidence of that when it happens.
right, because
But
oh,
yeah,
sorry. I was just gonna say because it very well could just be that, the king made the rule and then 2 weeks later had a bad dream or something, woke up and he was like, "Did I say 13? That's quite young. Let's make it 16." And then they changed it that way, right?
There's
Like
the
it's
accent. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I told you
Yeah.
it was going
Perhaps
to happen.
yeah, but so it could be that. It could be like, oh, like they let's make it 13 and then the kids are getting killed and people are getting, ooh, yeah, pull it back. Or maybe he just thought about that and just thought, maybe he had his 13-year-old niece come to court and he saw how young she was. And he's like, did I order those people to be killed?
No,
Yeah.
maybe it was like what we've talked about before with the Vikings and like message violence. Like, okay,
Mhm.
no, like you do something really like heinous like once or twice to be like, no, I'm serious. And then you don't have to do it anymore, or you can change it.
Mm.
Like once you've got people's attention and they know that you're going to do it. And especially with something like that, we're like, oh wow, he killed a 13-year-old over that, stealing a loaf of bread or something. Like, whoa. Okay, I guess we need to mind the king and behave ourselves.
Mhm.
And then you never have to do it again, really.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and I think we see this quite a lot. And actually, interestingly, separately in Scandinavian laws as well, I think this is kind of a general kind of concern in societies like this, which are extremely kind of honor driven. And most of what, or quite a lot of what these laws are about and the details they're going through is about feud in a way. And that's kind of what, especially the earlier ones, and even Alfred the Great's law, kind of the majority of about is compensation for a feud, in that it's not illegal to kill someone or to get in a fight or to do any of this, but it's about compensating them or their family. And that's kind of the honorable way that
Right.
things happen, that violence occurs. So then kind of the other really major category that becomes increasingly large in the 10th century is things that don't fall into that. And I think we get a sense that that's what they're really worried about, and they're more scared about things like theft, or things like they often describe as secret murder, secret killing,
Yeah,
because that's the bad kind of killing. If
right.
you get in a fight with someone and kill them, that's a
Fair
understood
game.
kind of part of this society that will be handled in a certain way. They're more worried about other things and people who are dishonorably committing crimes. And I think that's why Ethelstan seems obsessed with theft. And that's kind of a consistent, pretty much all of the law codes at one point talk about theft because they're really worried about it, because that's the sort of thing that then can't be regulated in the same way in that social fabric and can kind of cause that to fall apart. So back to your point of, I think that's why they're really relying on deterrence in that they're putting regulations and things, including rules that you essentially can't buy or sell anything without someone watching it and witnessing it and saying that they did. And then if people do steal things, the repercussions are really severe, much more so probably than anything else. Famous by the 10th century, it's pretty much seems like you're getting executed immediately if they can prove that you stole something.
Okay, last riff on this, but it just occurred to me that maybe it was just a flex by the king where he's like talking to his ministers. And like, just how much influence do I have with the people? And then they'd say, well, we don't know, sir. Well, let's make an arbitrary law and see if they kill 13-year-olds, that means I'm really powerful. So- and then some 13-year-old, but we don't know. We don't know if that actually happened, so we don't know the story. But still, I'm just that's the creative in me who's just thinking through these ideas of like, how can I prove that I'm powerful? And then you see this, they killed a 13-year-old in this tiny little village, and that's because I said something. I'm
Yeah.
powerful. It could have been an ego trip. I don't know. Anyway, that's my
Well, but at
last
the
riff
same
on
time,
that.
right? I mean, I don't think that they'd be legislating for things that they don't think they can enforce, right? Because then that would just undercut themselves at the same time, right? So I feel like they're pretty confident that they mean it when they're writing it down in these legislations, and at least they want people to follow the idea, maybe not every exact specifics, right?
Mhm.
See, so that to me then gets to, well, in our world where it's sort of like, okay, enshrined in law and words, lawyers are good wordsmiths. Lawyers know how to parse words and understanding what the law actually means. And, like you said earlier, Jake, sort of the idea of interpretation and stuff in the fact check world we live in and everything. I'd be interested in, sort of lived culture versus culture that's enshrined in law. Because one of the things that, maybe in my half lawyer brain, one of my fellow or my former deans used to say to me, you missed your calling as a lawyer. Because my question would be like, honorable or dishonorable, define honor for me. What do you mean by that? And so I don't know, in these kinds of cultures where England at that point, and so again, we're talking, say, 10th century, is pretty literate compared to Scandinavia still. And so having the idea or the ability to have it be more than just kind of this amorphous sort of thing that everybody kind of has an understanding. Well, I know what honor means. Okay, well, describe it to me. Well, like, but can I go then to some place, and like look in the law where it says, this is what we mean by this. If you behave contrary to this, this is going to be a problem for you. Have you seen anything like that?
Well, I think you're definitely right. And I think there's that sort of tension going on. But at the same time, I think we have to kind of open our minds a little bit to what we think law is, right? So having laws written down in a law code written by the king, that's one type of maybe what we should think of as legal behavior. Um, but that's not everything. And so I think even in these cultures where there's not kind of written law, which, as we can talk about, I think for most of the Viking Age, these Scandinavians are relying on oral systems of law.
Right.
Um, Things are different. So just because things aren't written down, or even maybe things are not in a kind of a set, rigid, what you'd call a legislative structure of instructions, even if that's oral, um, people still have an idea of what the law is and what is right and wrong. And so, kind of when it's often in think of disputes, and that when two sides are disputing, they're usually kind of not disputing the facts because it's pretty clear if someone did something wrong or not, maybe with complicating circumstances. It's usually disputing the details around it, and importantly compensation. That's sort of how everything works, is you're paying in order to make due for a wrong. um, but you don't necessarily need a specific kind of something written down telling you that it's wrong, right? You know that killing someone, that you need to make up for it in this way, and that's the honor driven in that culture. So I think the way that the law works in people's minds is completely connected to these other things of culture in a way that
Yeah.
is written down sometimes and sometimes is not. And that's something for us to have to think with and grapple with. And then we have interesting indications, particularly from Iceland, that for them law was thought of in an oral way, and that there's a law speaker as kind of as official a position as you can have in Iceland, because they have no officials and no positions really. That is their job, is just to know this stuff, and to recite it at different parts in assemblies.
Yeah, I want to be like at the all thing when he's saying that, and then be like, all right, somebody fact check the law speaker. How do you know? I mean, they actually did have a mechanism for that, as I understand it. Like the second tier of chieftains or somebody who actually knew enough to be able to like correct or what have you. But I mean, it is something that's so trying to explain to my students oftentimes of like how difficult it is for, I mean, we are just awash in text, right? We don't even remember things very much anymore because we can just look it up and we just take that for granted. And then to live in a world where you just cannot do that, you have to rely on people's memories and hopefully believe that they remembered it the right way and all of that. But the other thing I was thinking about that related to that and early law and stuff, I mean, has to do with enforcement. I mean, you said that word earlier. I mean, like, how does that work in these places that are so far flung from each other? And, okay, the king is ostensibly probably somewhere in southern England by that point, in the 10th century when you have quote unquote one united England. And I'm in York, and like, what do I care about the king's law? What's he going to do? Send guys up here to punish me? I mean, like, I mean, and I know there's probably then the chieftains or whoever's who are the local elite who are in cahoots with the king and they're the representative of the long arm of the law or something like that. I guess that's how it happens. But I mean, how spotty would have, that kind of stuff? I mean, it's one thing to say, well, this is the law. And it's like, yeah,
Mm.
so, like, so do something about it, like, what are you going to do?
Yeah. Well, I'm not an expert, but I think what I usually compare things to, and I try to make analogies with, and often following the work of Bill Miller, is just looking at Iceland, and that, as we are just saying of
Yeah.
um, Iceland has no king, has no governing structure at all, particularly in this Commonwealth period. Um, other than kind of being united through these understandings in which law is a really important part of. And Adam of Bremen, this later on chronicler, he says, Iceland is a kingdom ruled by not by a king, but ruled by the law. And I think that that's true, and that's kind of this central thing that I think there's actually quite a wide understanding of even any normal person kind of would probably have a much more detailed knowledge of kind of how the law worked, what was right and wrong, how things are paid for, how things could be made up for. Partially because it's essentially what those Icelandic sagas are talking about all the time. And it's a really an obsession. It's essentially what they're all about is the early family sagas are all these feuds between families and then coming to legal arrangements. So just to say, I think Iceland is this example of a place where there is no, officials enforcing things. There's no people who are permanent judges or anything like that. And yet they're regulating themselves in
Yeah.
a way, these societies on a local level. And then it seems to be that something will happen. People will kind of take a pause and then all go to the assembly. If it's the local quarter assemblies that happen a few times a year, or particularly the all thing once a year, or if it's really serious, you have to wait to the all thing. But it seems like that was part of the cultural understanding. And then that's where a problem is solved kind of through that means, even without kind of the real enforcement of a government in any way.
So you do have the ability to sort of somebody's watching, somebody's, yes. Well,
Well,
I
it's
mean, and I
it's
think that's the point.
society, right?
Yeah,
And social
exactly.
pressure and yeah.
Exactly. You see that in some of the Gragas laws where it'll say the case is with anyone who wants it, right? Which to me reads anybody in the society who wants to prosecute you for
Mm.
this has the right to do that. So, like your neighbors are watching out, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so of course that's probably why this also was quite unfair, right? And didn't always work of
Yeah.
essentially the only enforcement mechanism is the people that you've angered and their family or whoever that they can convince to ally with them, right?
Right.
So that means if someone is really powerful or from a wealthy powerful family, in a sense they're quite insulated from responses because people are scared to retaliate against them, which we can see happening in the saga sometimes. And that's why sometimes the law can kind of help encourage people through social pressure, but the only physical kind of state legitimate use of violence, right, doesn't really exist. So the only way to actually physically enforce something is with you and your buddies, which is just not going to be possible all the time. So it doesn't mean it's a fair system, and it
Yeah.
certainly didn't work all the time. But there's that kind of understanding that everyone had regulating everything.
Yeah.
Hmm. So, the big question I have, because I've always wondered about this, how much is this melting pot of legal traditions going to later affect the legal traditions of England as a whole? And then is it possible to make a connection with the political culture that would lead to, say, the formation of the United States? Is there a through line there that we can figure out based off of? Because it's kind of unique, right? You don't see that same mixture and the same tension, and it seems like the 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 Western English kingdom was interested in working with these people, the Danes who came in. So there must have been a blending. And if we think about the later Middle Ages, something pretty unique and spectacular happened in England that didn't happen in, say, France or anywhere else really, which was the Magna Carta, right? This kind of more, so it speaks to a different legal tradition that you don't see elsewhere. So I mean, how much can we say? I have a feeling you're going to say not much, but how much can we say? And is there a through line that we could say? Well, maybe like the United States legal tradition kind of could almost be like a great, 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 great grandchild of this melting pot moment, watershed moment in English history.
Well, people do like to say that about the Magna Carta for whatever reason. Like, oh, that's the opening
Yeah,
salvo for democracy or whatever. It's like, really?
Yeah.
yeah. Well, so I probably wouldn't say about extending to America and things like that, but definitely this is kind of the point of my entire PhD that I've been working on a few years. Is I'm making the case that by the time common law came together, which we often kind of define by that period, really starting with Magna Carta in 1215, um, people usually say, we can look backwards and we say, what is the background kind of for all these little details that we see in the common law era and for in the details within Magna Carta. Um, and they'll pretty much look back to say it's from the Anglo-Saxons or from the Normans. So I've been making the case that at least in certain areas and maybe little details here and there, we should also think about the Vikings and the Vikings in England and things going on in the Danelaw. And so I think it's really hard to make kind of sweeping uh, conclusions about English or American law being from the Vikings, but I think in certain areas it's really worth considering, especially some of those areas of the common law which are so important to how it works in England and in America in all common law countries today. So probably the biggest example of that is the jury system. Um, so in this text that I focus on the most is the Wantage Code from the late 10th century in the Danelaw, and it's clearly influenced by, I think, Danelaw Norse speaking elites. It has all these Norse words in it. It's very weird. It has all these different clauses that don't make any sense in an English context. One of those is about 12 thanes accusing people of theft, and always this obsession of theft, um, and then sending them to the ordeal. And so that's important because we then have what we think of as the first English juries are not trial juries like we have today, which decide if you're innocent or guilty. They're usually accusing juries called juries of presentment. And those appear in England in 1166 in the Assize of Clarendon. But they are exactly the same, pretty much, as these earlier Danelaw juries, in that they're doing the same thing. That they're 12 knights who, local notables of the area, who are accusing men of theft and sending them to the ordeal. And then there's a few other things we can think of the context of how that makes sense. So this is 150, 200 years apart. We can't make a direct connection between them, but it's really worth considering. These look extremely similar and they're functioning in the same way. And it's worth thinking about if this is a Scandinavian thing, especially if we can start to make comparisons, which I think we can to some degree, about groups of 12 men doing similar things in Scandinavian law. Of course, we have to be careful because it could just be a coincidence, because 12 is a good number. There's 12 apostles. It's important to Christianity. There's 12 is very well used in general. But I think we can see particular kind of patterns that really might make us at least wonder if there's a Viking background to the jury. And then that is kind of this trial jury we have today, which evolved out of these juries, is probably the most central part of how common law, criminal law works today in deciding if you're innocent or not.
That's super interesting because in the class that I teach about Viking history, we have a week where we talk about, so politics and people in power and all that kind of stuff. And I have my students read an article that Jesse Byack wrote a number of years ago where he talks about what's going on at the Althing and in Iceland as a proto-democracy. And, he describes the various levels of what's going on there. But then, so as a response to that article, one of the things I ask my students is say, can you see things that makes sense to you, because it's stuff that we still do, right, in some kind of way. And the whole kind of judges, juries thing usually shows up in basically every single response. I mean, they see it and recognize like, oh, that's like just how we do juries, or very similar to the way we do juries. So, I mean, even just like, using Iceland again, I mean, it seems to me like, yeah, it makes sense that it would be part of an influence there.
Yeah, and of course it's one of those things. Can't ever prove it, right? But we can just present some of the evidence, say this is interesting. This is also not a new thing. Especially some Victorians and antiquarians were interested in this and have been talking about it for a long time. But kind of my work has brought it back up and argued that we should take it a bit seriously, where recent historians have not. And I've tried to put together some of this other evidence looking at Scandinavian things. And really interesting to figure out the role of Thanes in England, which also I think has a big Viking role. And there's some interesting linguistic stuff. Denis Sukino Kamenko just finished a PhD working on this in detail. Um, but I think there is some suggestion that this is a particular kind of term of Thanes and these 12 Thanes in this jury that means something for how local law works in the Danelaw. And we see it show up kind of a number of times. And then groups of 12 men kind of show up in very similar ways, actually, even in the Doomsday Book. Show up, which maybe is the same thing, that sort of a local area, and back to nodes, right? Of if a local node would have groups of men who are essentially controlling kind of how the law works here. And in this very important aspect of being, they're deciding who to accuse of serious crimes or not. And then it seems like they're getting kind of the decisive factor in deciding who's going to then go to court or not and be tried for this, which then might later on have developed into kind of these ideas that led to a jury. But we can never really know.
We always have to end everything
Yeah.
with that, don't we? It's like, oh,
We
or else
don't really
preface
know.
everything with that.
Yeah, if and maybe, and well, I recall seeing was it the Terry Jones Medieval Lives
Oh
show
yeah,
that I
that was
enjoy so
good.
much,
Yeah.
where he went to Northern England and sat down with this like it was a group of farmers in Northern England, and they still followed I want to say pre-Norman law that was like that relates to the Dane law, where they were, and it was how they partitioned their plots and stuff like that. Because even when the Normans came in and instituted Norman law, as far as little villages, and they didn't really care how you partitioned the parcel, they just do it. Like if it works, right? And so then in this one pocket of England, in northern England, it persisted all the way. But to your point, Jake, the saying we don't really know. I think in the show he said, "Oh yeah, this comes from the Dane law." And now thinking back, like that's probably not true.
No, that's really interesting. And I mean, I think that's a helpful point that getting into kind of really detailed local levels can show us things. And particularly if it might be things that, yeah, were not such a big concern in kind of new legislative changes that got preserved for a long, long time. Um, the one area that I've worked on in that a little bit and thought about is in Lincolnshire. There's some records from the Doomsday Book, not to get too into detail in this weird land division stuff, but there's a suggestion that there is particular land divisions in this part of the Danelaw, especially in Lincolnshire, called 100, but they're different than the Anglo-Saxon 100. They're smaller, so we can call them small hundreds. Um, but it seems to be a particular thing in the way that land is organized there for an extended period, even well into then kind of the later medieval period. Um, and I think that there's some, it's not only land division, I think there's some administrative and legal reasoning behind it. And in the Wantage Code, I try to connect it to things to show that they're actually using these to punish people. And that if someone in that area would commit a crime, maybe everyone in that area would be fined in a way that's quite unique. Again, can't prove it, but something interesting to think about. But that sort of thing kind of carries on, and then we can see later. And Hannah Boston is working on essentially these details of land division in Lincolnshire in the later period, in the 1200s, 1300s, and she's also picked up on that. This seems to be kind of a quirk that is continuing, and maybe this is where it starts in the Danelaw, and that's why it's unique, and it's coming from Viking contact in the 10th century. But it's really interesting that it's continuing on for hundreds of years, and she's even noticing interesting things with it hundreds of years later.
Hmm. All right, so Terry Jones can have his credibility back. Maybe.
Oh, he was
Wonderful.
actually a medievalist historian in his own right, though, really. I mean, an amateur historian, but he was He wasn't just a TV presenter,
Didn't he have a PhD from Oxford? Did
or
several of
something.
them? Yeah,
Yeah, or
I actually
something.
he
Yeah.
actually was a medieval historian. I seem to remember something about that. I'll have to look
Yeah,
it
he
up.
was. Yeah.
Yeah.
When I used to teach the earlier he had a fun one on the Crusades, and I used to show one of his
Mhm.
videos there about how the Crusades got started, which, it was part Monty Python, so it was entertaining, but still it was good history as well. But well, so like what I'm trying to like envision here, and this kind of dovetails into stuff I'm working on a little bit, just as far as the approach. Um, Things change all the time. And I think what, as historians and people who are sort of investigating the past, by necessity, right? This is the whole sort of thing about like, well, why do we pick these dates, right? Well, this period goes from here to here or whatever. It's like, well, because that's just a convenient, you got to do that in order to sort of look at things relative to other things or whatever. But in reality, it's just, this just is saying to me that it's just so not that there isn't a moment in time where we can go, oh, and this is what the law was like in the 10th century. It's like, no, it's like an entire moving target. And like, it's very regional yet very local. And it just seems like to us, like this maybe a bunch of disparate bits that are unclear. And yet I'm just sort of curious about, again, kind of the lived experience of people in that time of like, what level of clarity would I have had? And it sounds like you're arguing that they probably would have had a fair level of understanding of what they were being held account to legally. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think much more so than we would generally think, legal culture kind of is a part of these societies in a way that they're probably much more aware of it than we're aware of our legal culture today, and that
Right.
it's affecting them on a local level, in a quite close sense. But also to your point of that everything is changing all the time, that is particularly the case sort of in this, and that's kind of why my the question that my PhD was kind of trying to answer is, or at least ask more questions is there Scandinavian influence on English law in 900 to 1200? The reason that that's so hard and that I've had to kind of create a new methodology, a new way of thinking about that, is because the law in England in general is changing so much from 900 to 1200 and is essentially unrecognizable, from, Anglo-Saxon England under Alfred the Great, where everything is sort of about feuds and paying people for cutting off their fingers, to essentially common law, working with, we soon have trial juries by 1200 and a kind of completely separate system. And so in all of those changes, you then are trying to figure out where is points of influence and specific development, maybe from the Vikings, and it's really hard, and things are changing a lot. And in general, right, that's a crazy time in England between 900 and 1200. And then, if we're even talking about just the 11th century, we have two invasions, and I think Canute usually doesn't get enough credit and gets forgotten about, as a huge successful invasion of England in 1016. But then another one in 1066, both of which changed the laws quite a lot, and we're working on that quite a lot. So.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's always the thing throughout history too, then, isn't it? Like through conquest. And then it's like, oh, well, that's out. I'm the law now. I'm the new sheriff in town. And it's all different now. Or not all different, but it's different. Yeah.
Well, and not to sidetrack about it, but I think it's interesting that Canute and William both almost do, at least they say they're doing the opposite, and they say that they're continuing on Anglo-Saxon law, as a way to kind of legitimize themselves and to kind of hope that people will relax kind of and accept the new regime. But in reality, we can see that they are actually changing things in
Yeah.
interesting ways, but we
Yeah.
don't actually get all those, legislation that's showing that very often.
Yeah, because there's definitely historical precedent for that too, I think. Even in the ancient world, it's like that's one of the oldest tricks in the book. When they tell you they're not changing anything, just wait for it. They're just playing a long game. It's coming. Well, then culture evolves, and it's internal, and aspects of culture get passed down to the next generation who learns from the previous generation and all of that. But, it's pretty also well known in the scholarship that culture evolves based on external exogenous factors, aka Vikings coming into England. So, It's just one of those things that is just a matter of the evidence, right? And being able to put it together and say, yeah, we know this. Because like earlier when you were talking about the communities and now the scholarship being like, oh, these are like big migrant communities. They aren't just warrior encampments or whatever. And it's always been sort of interesting to me, like, okay, it's the evidence. I just have to remind myself that all that is it's just a development in evidence or not. And largely it's archaeological evidence that has come to light, right, on that. Because otherwise, you're just sort of thinking in your right mind, at least I am, of like, no, this is like as old as warfare and human beings. There are always women and children and, large sort of swaths of humanity going from place to place because that's just how it works. It's just the nature of the beast. And so to act surprised about that seems disingenuous. But again, I just have to remind myself, well, we couldn't really make that leap without having the evidence. So, oh, the
No,
evidence.
definitely. And I think I should point out that that is essentially the rationale that for everything that I'm working on now, and that historians are now needing to completely rethink these narratives and how we thought about even say just the 10th century kind of for the last few
Yeah.
decades, because of that the evidence has changed primarily from archaeologists. And even within that, it's primarily metalwork, right? Is the thing, and some of the work of Jane Kershaw and Julian Richards and Don Hadley,
Yeah.
really changing kind of everything that we think about this stuff. And that is how I came to this project in the first place. Of that, we know pretty much for a fact now that this is a large kind of migration that we need to now think about. Okay, what does that mean of having large Anglo-Scandinavian communities? And well, look at that. Even at the end of the 10th century, they're being defined by their law and separated by the law. And then that region is called Danelaw. So let's figure out what that means.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which I can't say I've necessarily figured out, but I think I've shown a few things that I think are interesting.
Well, that's good. Hypothesize all day long, Jake, because that's what we do in this business, right? Like, just throw it out there because, it's kind of, in many ways, until the new evidence shows up, it's the business of answering unanswerable questions.
And
Yeah.
here we are again. Yep. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Really appreciated this. It's fun to get the juices turning and figuring out what's what, and then ending up in the same place. So, well, we don't really know, but that was fun.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, if anyone's interested in this and the legal stuff, my article from a few years ago, "Legal Culture in the Danelaw," is online for free if anyone's interested.
Yeah, we'll post a link to it in the show notes so people can get to it real easily. Yeah, awesome. So this has been
Yeah,
great. Yeah, like CJ said, it sort of gets the wheels turning for sure.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, and in your matching jumpers. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, you become so English now, you American. You're telling you to
Oh yeah.
call it a sweater. Come on, call it a sweater for us
A
Americans,
sweater.
please.
What's a jumper?